Welcome to the True Demon Lord show. I am the True Demon Lord Franco, and today we are going to be looking at questions you as a demon player should be asking your opponent at the start of your game. So this will be quite competitively minded. These will be questions you'll ask at the table when you're at an event, but you can definitely transfer these into your casual games. A lot of these questions, at least the first lot, will be quite generalized. They're questions you can ask no matter what faction you play, and it's just good practice to have these, to be able to ask these questions, to know kind of what to ask your opponent. I always think at the beginning of the game, when you first meet your opponent, you shake your hands, and then you kind of, gauge the game, gauge the opponent's list and army. This is where you start asking your questions, especially if you don't know the list or the army or the units you're playing into. This will help you. And in addition to that, it will also help you gauge your opponent, because we're all here to have fun, right? It is a game, but sometimes we have people that maybe are not on the same wavelength as yourself. So this is a good way to kind of help both of you get on that same wavelength, but also maybe gauge where the game could go in regards to your interactions with your opponent. So yeah, so we're going to look at some generalized questions that you should be asking no matter what. And then we're going to go more into demon specific questions. But these are questions that you should always, in my opinion, be having in your head, asking. And just maybe at the beginning of the game, but questions you can kind of broach throughout the game as well. So before we get into the rest of the video, if you like the content we make here, please consider liking and subscribing. It is free, it takes a few seconds, and it helps grow this channel further. And it is really appreciated by myself. And then, in addition to that, if you really like the content, if you want to gain a bit more, then consider becoming a true denizen through the YouTube memberships, where you'll get access to the member exclusive Discord. You'll get much more in-depth tactical and coaching style videos, as well as the chance to vote in polls on the content we'll make for the future, as well as even voting for some of my lists for upcoming events, and then a whole host of other things, more of a direct line to myself, similar to something on a coaching level. So more in-depth content to help you become better with demons, or just round off your game in general. So we are going to get into this. So you walk up to your table. This, like we said, this is going to really be for when you're playing at events, but you can definitely transfer this into just casual games as well, just to help you kind of get used to it and kind of know the kind of questions you should be asking. So you get to your table, you shake your opponent's hands, you introduce yourself, unless you already know each other. And then these are going to be just some questions that I think you should always broach, just for your sake and your opponent's sake. So first thing you should do is asking about the army rule and the detachment. So even if you go into the matchup and you already know the opponent's list, or you already know the opponent's army, you kind of played into them a few times, sometimes just refreshing yourself is always a good thing. Like, I always, Necrons are an army I play into quite a lot, just locally and then at events. And they get to heal D3 wounds in their command phase. I always believed it was at the beginning of the command phase for a long while, and I don't know why. I just touched on the subject, was like, oh, so you get to heal at the beginning of the command phase. My opponent was like, no, it's at the end of the command phase. So no matter how much you may play into something, sometimes, because we play into a lot of things, there's a lot of different rules in this game. Sometimes rules, the wires get crossed, or you just kind of lose the exact edge on how all the rules work for the armies that aren't your own. So it's always good just to refresh on that. And then it gets you an idea what the army does in general, how it's going to interact with your list, things you should be watching out for. Then the detachment rule. So again, knowing what maybe some detachments have specific buffs for certain units. For example, retaliation Cadra for Tau is very focused on the battle suits, just as one example. So this will give you kind of an idea of what units are going to be getting what benefits. Also, in addition, this will give you a little bit of knowledge. So say later on in the game, when the game's at its highest point, there's a lot going on. Maybe it gets a little bit tense just because, loads of actions going on. And maybe your opponent just uses a stratagem that your opponent had already told you was for a specific type of unit, and they've used it on another unit. Then you've got it in your head. You can at least question it and be like, oh, I thought, this stratagem only benefited battle suit units, for example. And then your opponent could go, oh yeah, sorry, I just a bit all over the place. I've made the mistake. So, because we're all capable of making mistakes, we're all human beings, right? And then just getting to know how the detachment works. Again, knowing what units it affects, if it affects any specific units or all the units, activations of the detachment's abilities, for example, hypercrypt for Necrons, like pretty much all uppy downy type of abilities, it is 3 units at the end of your turn. Your opponent can pick up 3 of those units and then bring them back down. I believe they can actually keep theirs in the air. They don't have to bring them straight back down. I could be wrong on that, but I think so. So getting to just know the intricacies like that. So yeah, just prepare yourself so you're not getting caught out by the general strategy of the army and your opponent's list specifically, and just knowing what units probably to watch out for more than other units. And like we already said, getting into your head kind of how their detachment works. So if any rules discrepancies come up later on in the game, you can kind of go back to that moment and be like, oh, well, I thought you said this, blah, blah, blah. So let's look at stratagems. So this is obviously going to be more into the detachment, since the stratagems come in the detachment, not for the army specifically. And these, you should always try and gauge what type of stratagems your opponent has, because again, stratagems are massive. And if you aren't too aware of certain stratagems, you can definitely be caught out and gotcha'd. Generally, a good rule of thumb is just to say to your opponent, so what are your stratagems, or what are stratagems that may affect me at this game, or ones that you will probably use? Because I've gone into lists where my opponent has stratagems that up their AP, or maybe, you know, take away cover saves or stuff like that. Well, of course, that doesn't affect us as demons. We don't care about AP and cover generally. So those are stratagems that aren't really important. But there are a lot of stratagems that are, and most of the time, if you ask your opponent what's your stratagems, what's your key stratagems, or most important ones, or the ones that I need to worry about, they will tell you. Sometimes you'll get an opponent that for whatever reason may be a bit mum on the detail, so knowing exactly what type of questions to ask here is quite important. So you should always ask, do they have any reactive move or move affecting strats? So by that I mean, a stratagem, for example, like Phantasm for Eldar. At the end of your movement phase, they can pick an infantry unit, roll a d6, and can immediately move that far. There are other stratagems in the game, or abilities, but we're just going to look at stratagems for now, where if you end a move within 9 inches, that unit can immediately make a move. Maybe they might have something where, you may, in the charge phase, they can make a move, or those type of things. So just getting to know, is there any reactive move or out of phase type of moves through stratagems that you can do? Move affecting strats as well is quite important. So asking your opponent, do you have any stratagems that could affect any of my units movements, in the movement phase, or can they affect charges? For example, Tau have a photon grenade strat, which I think is in Kalyon. So when you make a charge move against a Tau unit, they can pick your unit that's making the charge, minus to the charge, and then cause a battle shock. So basically, do you have any stratagems that will allow your units to move extra, either in my turn or your turn? Because again, a move shoot move stratagem, for example, Tau have one, Eldar have one, so they can just move in the shooting phase after they've shot. Or if, like the Elder one, they don't even need to shoot to do it, they can just make a move. And this is important to know for your positioning on objectives. For example, if you're only putting, say, 2 or 3 play bearers on an objective, your opponent's got quite a fast moving unit, it can move and then move again in their turn, and they could potentially take it off you. Or again, reactive moves, being able to move block you, or get out of charge range, or out of shooting range, or something like that. Then we have any buffs to hit, wound, or damage at all, like strats related to that. So this could be like them getting +1 to hit, or making you -1 to hit, +1 to wound, -1 to wound, +1 damage, -1 damage. Basically, do they have any or maybe more specifically buffs. The next one is debuff strat. So again, that would include -1 to hit, -1 to wound, -1 AP like armor of contempt, -1 damage. Both of these kind of go together. Basically, ask your opponent, have you got strats that include that improve your damage, your hit rolls, wound rolls, damage rolls, AP? Not that AP matters against us, or anything like that. Can you gain like any type of extra abilities from that? For example, like lethal hits, sustained hits. Can you increase, your critical hit roll so you can critical hit on 5s instead of 6s, meaning you will proc lethal hits or sustained hits on them, or dev wounds if it's on the wound critical wounds. And then, like we said, debuff strats, -1 to hit, -1 to wound, -1 AP, -1 damage. These are all important things to know because, again, if you've got a unit like Fiends and you're getting ready to go into a unit that has 2 wounds on each model, you're quite confident you're going to kill most of them or all of them, and then they pop the -1 damage strat. That could hurt, right? Or even -1 to hit. Have they got any stratagems that allow them to heal or return models? So this could be, return a model back to a unit, or D3 models back to a certain type of unit, just healing in general, something that's nice to know, specifically for like trying to stop objective controlling. So if you go into a unit, you're not going to fully kill it, but you can kill enough that you can out OC it on the objective, and then your opponent has a strat to just return models back, and now they out OC you again. Important to keep in mind. And then objective interaction strats. So any stratagems that can improve their OC, reduce your OC, or any abilities that or stratagems that lets them get certain type of buffs on objective. So if they're on an objective, they could get +1 to hit, or reroll hits or something like that. And this is stratagem specifically. Obviously, there are abilities as well that you should ask. Do any of your units get like certain buffs for me being on objectives or you being on objectives, etc., etc. So then we're going to move into key questions. So we've got 2 slides on this one because there's a lot of questions you should be asking. And to be honest, some of these stratagem questions you can actually apply as abilities as well. Like, do you have any reactive move abilities? Do you have any abilities that give you like rerolls to hit or wound on when you're on an objective, or I'm on an objective, etc., etc. So key questions you should always ask, and then this is specifically as a demon player, importantly, do they have any deep strike denial? And what I mean by that is a unit like Clamorous for Genestealer Cults, or Infiltrators for Space Marines. So units where they have a 12-inch aura of preventing a unit from coming in from reserve. So this is, of course, very important for armies like us, which use deep strike a lot. And obviously, a big part of our game plan is definitely deep striking with our 3-inch deep strike, 6-inch deep strikes, etc., etc. So by knowing if they've got any units that can prevent those units from coming in within 12 inches, meaning you can't even get charges from reserve, will potentially change your game plan. Maybe you might reserve less, or maybe you might now consider something like rapid ingress, etc., etc. Do they have any access to lethal sustained hits, and or do they crit on better than a 6? So lethal hits is, of course, when they make a hit roll and they roll a critical hit, which is a 6. It will automatically wound the target. Sustained hits is when they roll a hit roll. If they roll a 6, which is a critical hit, they will gain an additional hit, or an additional hit equal to the number after sustained hits. So if it's sustained hits 2, they'll gain 2 extra hits, etc., etc. Do they have a way to improve the critical roll? So a critical hit or a critical wound will always be on a 6. And to be honest, in addition to lethal hits, sustained hits, you should probably, I don't think I've included this, but you should ask as well about devastating wounds. Do they have like a good amount of devastating wounds, or can they proc a lot of devastating wounds off a certain unit or a certain interaction? And then again, asking, can they critical hit or critical wound on better than a 6, whether that's through a stratagem or an ability or an aura or something like that. So can they, automatically wound you with lethal hits on a 5 up or 4 up in some cases? Can they stack lethal and sustained? So do they have a unit that gets lethal and sustained and then proc it on a 5+ instead of a 6+? These are things you should definitely be watching out for, because this really threatened your greater demons. It pretty much wiped your little units off the board. So it's very key to know what units can do this, so you can either avoid them or be able to target them early. Does your opponent have any access to anti-monster? So whenever you have an anti-X type ability, it normally means and it will be followed by a number, equal to a dice roll. So, for example, anti-monster 4 plus means the weapon will always wound a monster on a 4 plus, and that will also class as a critical wound. So, for example, if a weapon has, I don't know, D6 plus 2 damage, and it's also got anti-monster 4 plus and devastating wounds, it means a roll of a 4 plus will cause D6 plus 2 devastating wounds. So again, this interacts with the one we just spoke about. Always something to keep in your mind. As demons, we tend to run 3 to 4 to 5 greater demons, which are all big monsters. So very important to know. Does your opponent have any uppy downy abilities? So similar to our Realm of Chaos, which lets us pick up 1 unit or 2 units at the end of our opponent's turn, if they're both in the shadows, and then we can bring them back down in our next turn. Does your opponent have any abilities that allow them to do that? So, for example, like we already said, Hypercrypt can do that at the end of every turn, end of every one of your turns. Grey Knights can do it as well. That's through detachment rules. Vespids, which are a unit for Tau, can do it as well. Scouts for Space Marines can do it. Always ask how their interaction works with it. So, for example, Vespids, they just don't have to be in engagement range, they can go up. Whereas Scouts, they have to be outside of 6 inches. So knowing that, how the interaction works, means you know how to stop it. With Scouts, just get within 6, you don't even have to touch the unit. You stop the uppy downy. Some units, like I think Votan bikes, have to be within 6 inches of a board edge before they can do it. So ask, do they have uppy downy abilities or abilities to pull units off the board, and what is the parameters to be able to activate said abilities. And then ask about, do they have any way to deep strike closer than 9 inches? So do they have any 3-inch deep strike abilities or stratagems or whatever? Aquilons, Trigons, Inceptors, all those units can come down 3 inches away standard. Armies like us, GSC, Retaliation Cadre for Tau, Hypercrypt for Necrons, all have like 3-inch deep strike abilities, or stratagems, sorry, so that is in the form of a stratagem itself. Always good to know. And then there doesn't really tend to be other armies in the game aside from us that can come in, between 4 and 8 inches. So normally it's 9 inches unless you've got 3-inch deep strike strat. Demons are the only army in the game that can come down outside of the 3 inches and the 9 inches with the 6-inch deep strike. But it's still always good to know, just in case there's something you've missed. Then next set of questions, rerolls. Like, what's their reroll capability like? Does any units have inbuilt rerolls a hit or wound or both? Is there some kind of caveat to how they can gain rerolls? Some units will get like generally a reroll hit roll of 1 or wound roll of 1. Or if they're targeting a unit that is on an objective, they might get to reroll either or whatever. If their unit specifically is on an objective, they'll get to reroll it. Most of the time, if their unit needs to be on an objective to get the rerolls, they've also got to control the objective itself. So always, not just ask, do you have any access to rerolls? Can any of your units get rerolls? But then also ask, how does that activate? Because it's very important. If they've got to control the objective that their unit is on to get it, then you can kind of manipulate that. You can kind of go against that. It might influence, maybe say your opponent is trying to kill a unit or kill models on an objective, to then reduce your OC on that objective, so they can now control it, and then their unit on the objective can then get the full benefits from their rerolls. It might influence you to maybe use a command reroll or a stratagem like demonic invulnerability for rerolling 1 to 1. That way you can maybe prevent them getting the full benefits of their reroll abilities in certain circumstances, if you get what I mean. I know there was a lot of words there, but basically, do they have any units that can use rerolls, whether to hit, wound, or both? Is there ways they can gain rerolls? If so, how do their units get access to rerolls? What's the caveat? What's the trigger? Etc. etc. And then is there a way you could potentially stop it? Overwatch potential. So, a question I will always ask. I don't know if there's really any of it in the game. I've not come across it. There are. That's a lie. There is definitely some units in the game. So, can they Overwatch one better than a 6? And I know. And I guess this kind of also comes into, can they shoot out of phase? I haven't included it, but we'll include it here as well. So not death marks, hex marks for Necrons can, Telemorphs for Gene Silicots can. I think death marks can shoot in your movement phase as well, or your shooting phase or something. So can they overwatch on better than sixes, or can they just make a shooting move out of phase? This is always something to watch out for. So if you've got, like I say, one fiend on 3 wounds left and it moves, and then they've got a unit like, I don't know, a Hex Mark Destroyer that will hit on 2s, wound on 3s, and force you to take a bunch of like 4 or 5 up invuns, you could lose that unit, meaning your whole game plan of trying to get, say, engage or containment or something with that model is now gone. So always good. Can your units, I'm going to actually write it on here because I didn't actually fully write this bit. So can your unit, or does your unit have any good Overwatch potential? Do they have flamers? If they have a unit that has like a bunch of torrent weapons that automatically hit, that's obviously very good for Overwatch. Um, out of out of phase shooting. That's all right. Do they have any reactive or out of phase moves? So similar to what we said in the stratagem bit with reactive moves and that, do their units have any inbuilt ways of reactive moving? Is there any like triggers that cause a reactive move? This could be like when you end a move within 9 inches of an enemy unit, they can immediately make a move of whatever. Or there could be something like a what do you call it? A surge move. So surge moves, things like Accursed Cultists have it, Berserkers have it. I think there's some Tyrannid stuff that has it as well. So when a unit is shot at, they can immediately make normally a d6 move towards the closest enemy unit. You should definitely know about something like this because those kind of moves normally allow them to end in engagement range. This means that that unit will now get the fight between your unit before your unit, because your unit didn't make a charge move, so they doesn't gain fight first, and because it's your opponent's unit and it's in your turn, they get to fight or get to pick the activation after all fight first abilities are done. So definitely something to keep track of. Also, especially if you haven't declared any actions yet, and then they get a surge move and they surge into a unit you were going to declare an action with. Now you can no longer declare an action with that unit, so that's very important to know. Something else, there was so any kind of triggers. I'm trying to think because I know I had something in my head a second ago that kind of interacted with the one above as well. Reactive. Oh, so including the reactive or out of phase moves and on top of like the Overwatch potential or out of phase shooting, is there any like shoot back ability? So for example, like Wraithguard, if you shoot at them, they can shoot back at you, and there's a few other units in the game that can do this, either a stratagem or just an ability. This is something important because we have good shooting, but generally our shooting is more chip damage or very good at killing small toughness 3 units or crippling toughness 4 units, like Bellical shooting, Shalaxi, the Keepers. You're great on Clean One shooting, is very good into toughness 3. The Lord of Changeover obviously is very good at shooting, same as the Soul Grinders. So if they have any units with a way, like an ability or even access to a stratagem that lets them fire back at a unit that's shot at them, that's very important to know, because if you are just basically doing some menial chip damage, you might kill 1 or 2 models, and then all of a sudden they can shoot back at you and kill you or do a lot of damage to you. That's not worth it. So yeah, again, always you can kind of include this in like one bubble. Do they have any out of phase interaction? So can they move? Can they shoot? Can they charge? Can they do anything they could normally do in their turn in your turn through some kind of stratagem or ability? Any important buffing, debuffing auras or abilities? So what I mean by this is you're basically asking your opponent, what are like the best auras or buffs in your army? Like, for example, there might be some characters that have like a +1 or +2 to move, or +1, +2, whatever to advance or charge, +1 to saves, or an invulnerable save aura, or anything along those lines. So really important buffs, maybe specifically picking out characters and going, what are the auras on this character? What are the auras on this character? What are pretty big auras that your army kind of hinges and relies on? And And then if you want to get like granular, do you have any invulnerable save auras, any feel no pain auras? Do you have any extra movement auras, any auras or abilities that give you extra move, give you any like pluses to advancing, charging, any like +1 to hit auras, +1 to wound auras, or any abilities like that. And on top of that, things like Oath of Moment, which is the Space Marine ability or the Space Marine army rule, where they pick a unit and all of their stuff gets a reroll hits against it. That's also another important one. So this comes under important abilities. Do they have an ability that lets them pick one of your units specifically and get better against it with the rest of their army? So again, this all comes under that one banner of, do they have any important buffing or debuffing auras / abilities? Again, sometimes your wording has to be exact here, because unfortunately those type of opponents who will take advantage of what you've said do exist. I've played into a couple of them in all the games I've played, where, you know, you might say, do you have any important auras? And he'll say, oh no, not really. But they have an important ability, because an ability isn't an aura. Yes, it's not many people, but there are the one or two people out there where I've been like, come on, you knew what I meant, like when I was asking about important rules like that. So trying just to be specific, also not just to try and, you know, stop people from catching you out, but also when you're asking questions, you might ask a lot of questions. It's very, like, we're all human beings. Your opponent could very well just, you know, they're trying to answer all the questions, trying to get everything out. They might just forget one or two things. So just trying to be very specific will hopefully jog their memory, and just so they know what to answer. And then this one seems very stupid, but basically, what are the unit types? Now, what I mean by this, and I'll give you an example, and I assume there'll be a lot of other demon players that feel this. The amount of times I've gone to move a unit of fiends and I've moved them through a wall, and I've had my opponent go, whoa, wait, you know, you have to go round, you can't go through the wall, blah, 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 mounted can't go through walls. And then you're like, yeah, I know mounted can't go through walls, but fiends are beasts. And I've had someone tell me, no, they're not beasts, they're mounted. And I'm like, no, that's seekers. And they're like, no, fiends are mounted. I'm like, trust me, they're not. So, yeah, like, just because a unit might look like something doesn't mean it is. For example, the Triumph of St. Catherine, that is infantry, even though it's a bunch of like sisters carrying a big like coffin thing. You know, it can go through walls, things like that. Fiends, I guess they do look like big horses, so I do get when people think they're mounted. And also I think people confuse fiends and seekers sometimes. So just clarifying with your opponent, is that unit infantry, or is it a beast? Or is that unit a beast? Is it mounted? Is that a swarm? Is that a monster? There are sometimes big things that look like monsters but might not be. Lictors, I kind of guess, come under that. They are infantry, but they could maybe look like little monsters. So these are good questions. It seems very simple and self-explanatory and common sense, but it is Games Workshop, it is 40k. Sometimes things don't make sense. It is just good to know, so you don't think, okay, well, this unit's going to have to come around the wall, so I won't have to worry about it, and getting a charge, and then all of a sudden it just goes straight through the wall. Generally, if you're like declaring, like when you're trying to measure distances, it's always good to be in the open with your opponent. Say, okay, I think I'm quite far away. Like if this unit has to move around here, I'm going to be over 12 inches after its movement, so it's not going to be able to charge me. And then your opponent will go, oh no, it's a beast, it can actually go through walls. And then you're like, okay, cool, now I know where I can be charged. I need to potentially move or protect this unit a little bit better. So again, just trying to keep clarity in your game. That's what it's all about between both sides, and allowing human error to come in, because it's going to come in. You know, again, we're all human beings. And then the last thing is, how well do they know demons? So this is one of the first questions I ask when I get to a table. It's, how well do you know demons? Because it can be quite tricky. We have some very big abilities that can definitely be gotcha if your opponent doesn't know about it. And I think it is, for not just demon players, but for every player, I think you are, I think you should always make sure your opponent knows what you can do. You should never rock up to the table and either assume your opponent knows just because you're playing something that's quite popular, or don't think it's your job to inform your opponent. I think every player should at least broach the question, do you know what I do, or do you know the type of things I can do? I've had people go, I haven't got a clue, so I will try and explain everything, but obviously when you're explaining a bunch of new rules to someone, it will go in one ear, will go out another ear. So by just slowly explaining it and then just being like, look, if you ever get confused, ask questions, and I will try and remind you of certain things during the game. Like if my opponent, for example, let's say Be'lakor, obviously he's got Reefed in Shade, so the 18-inch Lonut bubble. The amount of times I have people measuring 24-36 to something within 6 inches of him, and I will always, without doubt, without fail, say, look, don't forget the 18-inch bubble. And then people will go, oh shit, yeah, thanks for reminding me. And I think that's just the way the game should be played. Um, Not expecting your opponent to forget these things and then being like, you're too far away, you can't shoot. I know you set up, but oh well. That is definitely the wrong way to play this game and not a way you should be playing it. So yeah, so I will always tell them, or always ask, right, do you know how the Shadow of Chaos works? If they say no, you explain it as briefly and as easy as you can, simply stating my deployment zone is always classed as being within my army Shadow of Chaos. At the start of any phase until the end of the phase, if I control half or more objectives in no man's land, the Shadow of Chaos will be up. Same as your deployment zone. If I control your opponent, the objective in your deployment zone at the start of a phase until the end of the phase, Shadow of Chaos will be in your deployment zone, and it is procced phase by phase. I will let them know that if I take half the objectives in my turn and they take me off at least one of those, if I have 2 objectives out of 3 and they take me off one of those, coming into my movement phase, I won't have it. I will then also inform them the battle shock buffs/debuffs, because they can come up and be very important, especially if your opponent has any like abilities or weapons that proc battle shocks, and that should be a question as well. Can you proc battle shocks out of phase? So for example, plague burst mortars for plague burst crawlers for death guards. When a mortar hits something or shoots at something, you have to take a battle shock on that unit. Always like inform your opponent, like if they do have any ways to force battle shocks, just remind them if I'm in the shadows I do get the heal, especially on my big things, especially on my battle line, because I get to return D3 models back to battle line, like plague bearers, nurglings, pink horrors, etc. And then also reminding them that if they take a battle shock in the shadows, they're -1 and they take D3 wounds if they fail. I would always, like, if my opponent has to do battle shocks, so I'm very much on battle shocks because I find that's something that's very commonly forgotten. So when it comes to that part of the game, I would always say to my opponent, right, you've got this battle shock, this battle shock, this battle shock. This one is not in my army Shadow of Chaos, so you're fine, it's just a normal battle shock. These 2 are, so they will be at -1, and if you fail, you take D3 mortals. I always want people to know that, because if they know that, that might influence them on using insane bravery to auto pass it, or procking any abilities or stratagems they may have, or just so they're prepared for it. Sometimes people roll too fast and they fail it, and I'm like, look, you've just taken D3 mortals, blah blah blah, you are -1, so you fail. Like, I don't mind if you want to just auto pass that instead, because again, we try and get through this game fast. The 6-inch deep strike, that is definitely something you should always check with your opponent that they know of, whether that be through natural shadows or around your greater demons and Be'lakor. Always inform your opponent of it. Your stratagems, so just make sure your opponent knows you can go up and down with 1 or 2 units, if they're both in the shadows, of course. Denizens of the Warp, so let your opponent know you have a 3-inch deep strike. Warp Surge, you can advance and charge from the shadows. They're ones that generally are quite needed to be known. Sticky objectives throughout real space is also one to be known as well. Rerolling ones of 1 isn't bad, +1 AP also, but these 3 are pretty much if my opponent goes, just name me like your top 3 stratagems that I need to know of, these are the 3 that I would put forward. Because while +1 AP is good, I don't find it to be like enough of a like kind of catch you out type of strat. Same with reroll ones in the shooting phase. Same as really sticky objective, though it can be a little bit, especially because it does give you a shadow bubble around the objective as well. But up and down, 3-inch deep strike, advance and charge, definitely important strats that your opponent should really know. And then also the interaction with your shadow bubbles. So if any of your units are within range of a greater demon of the same god or Be'lakor, that they get the bonus to their battle shocks, or your opponent gets some minus debuffs to their battle shocks, or that you can drop within 6 inches. And then I always explain to them how go up, come down, use the 3-inch deep strike to get into any kind of gap with Be'lakor or whoever, and then 6-inch deep striking around like a drop pod and going forward and charging. That is something I would always explain. If my opponent goes, yes, I know about it, that's fine. Sometimes you'll get your opponent go, oh, okay, I didn't actually realize that. And I also try and, put into my opponent's head at least once, that at the beginning of the game once, I have the 3-inch deep strike. I can use it on one of the monsters to get in a gap and then spit out. There's only so much you can remind your opponent, and if your opponent makes mistakes, they make mistakes, but you want to try and give them all the information so they're not making the mistakes through not ignorance, but just not knowing what's going on. And then your greater demons as well, since they are the most important thing in your list, generally, they should really know about them or what they do. So run them through what Be'lakor does with his with his shadow bubble, plus obviously the Reefed in Shades, greater ground clean ones. If you're running the endless gift, just how tough he is, your -1 toughness debuff, um, you know, Shalaxi, I think, is an important one to let your opponent know about all the rerolls, and she can kill almost anything in the game. So again, just giving a brief rundown on the important parts of your list. And again, your opponents will probably be asking questions as well. These are the ones that kind of come up, or the kind of information that you should be feeding into your opponent. So yeah, hopefully that, and there was a lot of words there, and hopefully you didn't get a little bit too confused, but these are all abilities that you should be, or not abilities, these are questions that are very good to ask. Maybe take a notepad or get a printout and, take some of these or generalize them, or put them into words that will be best suited to you understanding them. And then maybe if you're newer to events, or maybe you're not newer to events, but you want to maybe up your game, having this printout just to put down and go, okay, and then maybe just read them off at the beginning of the game, because information is very important in this game. Knowing what your opponent's army can do, knowing what their units can do, knowing kind of strategies they can potentially employ during the game, or type of things they can do during your turns and their turns, is all very important, because there's nothing worse than, having a whole great idea and strategy in your head, and then you set up to go and do it, and then your opponent just turns around and goes, cool, I'm just going to do this, 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 and this in your turn. Now your turn means nothing, and you're just sat there going, cool, I'm now out in the open, I can't shoot or charge what I need to shoot or charge, and now I'm dead. And that's really feels bad, and you don't want that. And then obviously, because we have ways around certain things like reactive moves, and stuff like that. Deep Strike doesn't trigger it, because reactive moves all generally have, like, apart from maybe surge moves, because they trigger off of being shot at. But reactive moves, where they can move when your unit ends a normal, fallback, or advanced move, are all bypassed with Deep Strike, which is something we do a lot, of course, because Deep Strike is classed as a normal move that you start, but you never actually finish. So that means you never trigger any ability or stratagem or anything that says when an enemy unit ends a normal, advanced, or fallback move, you will never trigger it off a Deep Strike. Of course, you do still trigger Overwatch and stuff like that, but specifically for reactive moves and stuff like that. So yes, hopefully you were able to get a good amount of information from this, and you can take this, learn from it, and maybe use these questions at the start of your game, maybe help you raise your game a little bit, because now you'll be able to kind of know the questions you should be pitching to your opponent, and then using those questions to kind of create a game plan and have more insight into the game and the matchup, especially if you don't know the army you're playing into, or again specific units. This is a good way to learn quickly on the fly, and then kind of get an idea in your head, rather than just waiting to see what it does and then being like, oh, that's what this does, okay, cool, well, I've lost the game now, but sweet. You don't want that. You want to at least have something ready, so if it does happen, great, but at least you kind of had an idea it was going to happen. So yeah, so thank you for tuning in. Again, if you like this content, please leave a like and subscribe. It is greatly appreciated. And if you want to further support us, consider becoming a true denizen. And keep up to date with Facebook and Instagram, where you can see all of our uploads, tournament reports, and all that kind of stuff. And we will catch you all in the next one.